My relatives always laughed at my grandmother. They mocked a retired army nurse who clipped grocery coupons and wore the exact same wool coat for 15 winters. They called her life small because it lacked the cheap sparkle they so desperately craved. What none of them understood was that her quiet poverty was not a failure, it was armor. And by the time they discovered her $12 million trust, she had already arranged their ruin. My name is Anna Hawthorne. I am 35 years old. And today, I buried the only real mother I ever knew. We stood at the graveside less than 3 hours ago, listening to a military chaplain read a brief, standardized prayer over the casket of Margaret Hawthorne. The sky had been an unforgiving, pale gray, matching the exact color of the headstones lining the Fayetteville Cemetery. While the chaplain spoke of service and sacrifice, my relatives checked their expensive watches, shifted their weight in their designer shoes, and whispered about dinner reservations. Now, the funeral was over, and the vultures had officially descended upon the heavy mahogany tables of a private dining room in downtown Charlotte. The restaurant was the kind of establishment my grandmother would have politely declined to enter. She would have taken one single look at the imported Italian marble floors, the velvet curtains, and the menu offering $150 plates of seared scallops, and she would have calmly suggested we go home to put a kettle on the stove. But Maggie was not here to object. Instead, her children and grandchildren had commandeered the occasion of her passing to perform their absolute favorite routine. They were pretending to mourn while aggressively broadcasting their own social status. Aunt Denise flagged down a waiter with a sharp snap of her manicured fingers to order her third mimosa. She adjusted a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the dim, amber lighting of the restaurant, leaning across the table with a theatrical, heavy sigh. "I mean, God rest her soul," Denise said, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "But Maggie lived like she was waiting for the Depression to come back any minute," Denise laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that cut through the soft background music. "I always told her she could afford to update that awful, cramped kitchen, or maybe buy a car that was not built in the 1990s. But she guarded every single penny like it was made of solid gold. It was honestly embarrassing." Cousin Brooke, who was Denise's daughter, scoffed while aggressively pushing an organic arugula salad around her plate. Brooke had worn a custom black silk dress to the cemetery, treating the damp grass like a fashion runway. "That old duplex in Fayetteville is literally crumbling," Brooke said, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Honestly, her whole life is just proof that patriotism does not pay. All those years deployed overseas, all those supposed medals and commendations in boxes, and she dies in a house that smells constantly of mothballs and cheap floor wax. It is tragic, really." Uncle Randall, swishing a very expensive dark bourbon in his crystal glass, nodded heavily. Randall was a man who always spoke as if he were delivering a press conference to an adoring public. "That is the ultimate tragedy of it," he sneered, leaning back comfortably in his oversized leather chair. She told all those grand army stories. The bedside trauma units, the field hospitals, saving lives in godforsaken war zones. But let us be brutally honest with ourselves. If any of those stories had really mattered, if she had truly been someone of consequence, somebody important would have shown up before she died. Look around this room. It is just us. The military forgot her the very second she took off the uniform. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on my untouched water glass. I stayed perfectly quiet. It was the primary survival tactic I had learned early on when dealing with this specific side of the family. Let them talk. Let them expose exactly who they were. But their cruel words felt like physical blows against my chest. They did not know the woman who had raised me for over 10 years of my childhood, when my own parents could not. They did not understand her. They did not know the fierce discipline, the profound dignity, and the quiet, meticulous rituals of that modest Fayetteville duplex. I remembered the perfectly folded hospital corners on my small bed, the comforting scent of lavender soap, the way she could sit in absolute peaceful silence on the porch for an hour just watching the rain fall. I remembered her heavy wool coat, the one she wore for 15 harsh winters without a single word of complaint, and the careful way she clipped grocery coupons at the kitchen table every Sunday morning. Her life was not small because she lacked ambition. It was perfectly, intentionally contained. She never performed wealth for people who only respected superficial appearances. As the first plates were cleared away, the conversation shifted seamlessly from condescending pity to outright, naked calculation. The inheritance talk began. "We need to move incredibly fast on the house," Randall declared, aggressively tapping his silver fork against his empty plate. "The real estate market is decent right now, even for a total tear-down property. If we get a junk removal crew in there by next weekend, we can clear out her belongings fast. Pitch the garbage, donate the old clothes to whatever charity will take them, and get the land listed before the end of the month." "Exactly," Denise chimed in, nodding so vigorously her earrings shook. "There is absolutely no point in dragging this out. We can divide whatever tiny scraps are left in her bank accounts and put this whole depressing chapter behind us. I cannot imagine she left enough to even cover the property taxes for another year." Brooke's fiancé, Tyler Wynn, leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. Tyler was a junior corporate attorney who wore far too much cologne and treated every family gathering like a hostile deposition he was destined to win. He flashed a brilliant, entirely hollow smile at the table. "Listen, guys," Tyler said smoothly, projecting his voice so everyone would hear. "You do not need to stress about the legal side of things. I am happy to help. I will have my lead paralegal draft the standard probate forms on Monday morning. It is clearly a simple, small estate. No major assets, no complex trusts, no hidden portfolios. Estates like this are highly vulnerable to state taxes and fees if we do not handle them cleanly and quickly. I can run point on the entire thing and save you all the ridiculous hourly legal fees." Tyler looked around the table, radiating a smug, self-satisfied generosity, making it abundantly clear that he thought he was doing noble charity work for financially illiterate peasants. As Tyler basked in the family's grateful murmurs and relieved sighs, my eyes drifted away from him and toward the far end of the long dining table. Elias Mercer sat there, completely still. Elias had been Maggie's personal attorney for nearly 3 decades. Unlike my loud, flashy relatives in their designer mourning clothes, Elias wore a plain, meticulously tailored charcoal suit that had likely cost more than Tyler's entire wardrobe. Elias had not touched his food. He was nursing a single glass of water, simply watching the room with an unsettling, profound calm. His dark eyes tracked methodically from Denise to Randall, then rested briefly on Brooke and Tyler. He was not just listening, he was taking mental inventory of their greed. He was cataloging every insult, every assumption, and every arrogant plan they made. When his sharp gaze finally shifted and met mine, his facial expression did not change at all, but I felt a sudden, distinct shift in the atmosphere of the room. A cold shiver ran down my spine. He knew something they did not. The luncheon dragged on for another agonizing hour. Expensive coffee was served alongside miniature desserts, followed by half-hearted hugs and loud, insincere promises to group text each other about the estate clean-out schedule. As the group finally began gathering their cashmere coats and designer bags to leave, the noise level rose with their cheerful goodbyes. During the commotion, Elias quietly stepped around the milling crowd. He moved with the silent grace of a ghost and suddenly appeared directly at my side. His voice was incredibly soft, pitched low enough that only I could hear it over the din of clinking china and false condolences. "Anna," he said, his tone commanding immediate attention. I looked up at him, gripping my purse strap tightly. "Yes, Mr. Mercer?" "Before your family touches a single item in that house," Elias instructed, his eyes locking onto mine with intense gravity. "And before any of these so-called scraps are distributed to anyone in this room, you need to come to my downtown office tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I frowned, deeply confused by his absolute certainty and the secretive nature of his request. "What for?" I asked, keeping my voice just as low as his. Elias briefly glanced over his shoulder. He watched Tyler, who was loudly tipping the maitre d' with a flourish of cash. And then he looked back at me. A faint, almost imperceptible shadow of a smile touched the corner of the old lawyer's mouth. "Your grandmother left very specific instructions," Elias said quietly. "There is a sealed packet, and it is entirely, exclusively for you." The heavy oak door of the Mercer Law Group closed with a solid thud, shutting out the morning traffic of downtown Charlotte. At exactly 9 o'clock, I sat across from Elias in his private office. The walls were lined with thick, leather-bound books, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. He did not offer me coffee or pleasantries. Instead, he reached into his desk drawer and slid a thick manila envelope across the immaculate mahogany surface. Resting on top of the envelope was a heavy brass key, tarnished with age. "Your grandmother instructed me to hand this to you precisely 24 hours after the funeral," Elias said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "You must open it right now." My hands trembled slightly as I broke the thick wax seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cardstock, typed on the old Smith Corona typewriter Maggie had kept in her living room since the 1980s. The ink was slightly faded, but the words hit me with the force of a physical strike. "My dearest Anna, if you are reading this, the vultures have already started circling. I know my own blood. Do not trust any urgent family consensus. They will try to rush you. They will tell you I had nothing. Let them believe it. Take the brass key. Find the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Inside a blue tin that says Danish butter cookies, you will find a heavy silver service coin. Take it and go alone to the address on the back of this letter in San Antonio. Tell no one. Love, Maggie." I stared at the typed letters, entirely stunned. My grandmother had always projected an image of a perfectly ordinary, quiet retirement. She baked bread. She watched evening game shows. She swept her porch every single morning at 7 o'clock. The idea that she had prepared such a careful, secretive chain of instructions felt like waking up to find a stranger wearing her face. I looked up at Elias, searching for an explanation, but he simply nodded toward the door, indicating our meeting was over. The drive back to Fayetteville took almost 2 hours. My mind raced the entire way, trying to reconcile the grandmother I knew with the author of that letter. When I finally pulled onto her street, my breath caught in my throat. Aunt Denise's silver luxury vehicle was parked in the driveway, right next to Uncle Randall's oversized pickup truck. I threw my car into park and sprinted to the front door, pushing it open. The familiar, comforting smell of lavender and floor wax was completely gone, replaced by the sharp, chemical scent of heavy-duty trash bags and cheap air freshener. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the narrow hallway. Aunt Denise popped her head out of the kitchen, holding a stack of mismatched floral plates. "Oh, Anna, good, you are here. We figured we would get a head start on sorting the junk. Half of this stuff is completely worthless, so we are just bagging it up for the donation center down the street." "You did not ask me," I said, my chest tightening with hot anger. "The estate has not been sorted. You have no right to be in here." Uncle Randall emerged from the hallway, carrying a cardboard box overflowing with winter coats. "Relax. We are doing you a massive favor. Nobody wants to spend their whole weekend digging through moth-eaten rags." A sudden flash of light caught my attention from the direction of the spare bedroom. The room Maggie had always kept locked. I pushed past Randall and strode down the hall. Tyler was standing in the middle of the room. He had forced the door open. Spread out on the small twin bed were Maggie's framed nursing certificates, a stack of old leather-bound ledgers, and a pile of faded military deployment papers. He was holding his expensive smartphone directly over them, rapidly snapping photographs of the documents. "Put the phone down," I commanded, my voice dropping an octave. Tyler looked up, completely unbothered. He offered that same smug, practiced smile. "Just doing some preliminary inventory. Anna, since I'm handling the probate, I need to know exactly what kind of liabilities we are looking at. These old records might have some outstanding debt attached to them." "Get out," I said, stepping between him and the bed. "All of you. Leave this house right now." Tyler blinked, clearly offended that I was not showing the proper deference to his legal expertise. He slipped his phone into his tailored jacket pocket and let out a dramatic, condescending sigh. Fine. If you want to play the grieving, irrational granddaughter, go ahead. But do not call me crying when the city hits you with a property code violation next week. I stood my ground, staring him down until he finally brushed past me. It took another 10 minutes of arguing, complaining, and slamming doors before Denise and Randall finally packed into their vehicles and drove away. The moment the house was silent, I locked the deadbolt and went straight to Maggie's bedroom. The air felt heavy, violated by their brief presence. I knelt beside the heavy cedar chest resting at the foot of her neatly made bed. The brass key from Elias fit perfectly into the old lock. It turned with a satisfying, heavy click. I lifted the lid, expecting the familiar scent of cedar and old wool. Instead, I found a masterclass in deception. Maggie had preserved everything important, but she had brilliantly disguised it all under the most mundane, ordinary objects imaginable. I pulled out a stack of faded church offering envelopes. Inside them were not tithe receipts, but heavily redacted military transport logs. I found a rusted sewing box stuffed with thread spools. Beneath the spools was a false bottom hiding tightly rolled architectural blueprints of field hospitals. Old, crinkled pharmacy bags held commendation letters signed by high-ranking military officials, their names completely unfamiliar to me. Then, buried at the very bottom, I found the blue tin that once held Danish butter cookies. I opened it. Resting on a bed of yellowed newspaper was a heavy, solid silver service coin. It was deeply engraved with the insignia of an Army medical command and a Latin motto I could not translate. Beside the coin lay a stack of 5 black waterproof field notebooks. I carefully opened the first notebook. The pages were filled with Maggie's precise, looping handwriting. They were not diaries. They were deeply technical, terrifyingly detailed medical records. There were precise anatomical sketches of arterial bleeding, complex supply lists for mass casualty events, and strict timing notes detailing exactly how many minutes a body could survive severe trauma before organ failure. Every few pages, there were lists of names. Some were circled in blue ink. Many others were crossed out in thick, heavy black ink. The black ink meant they did not make it. I sat on the floor for hours, reading page after page. The weight of her reality began to crush the image of the fragile, poor old woman my family had constructed. My grandmother was not simply thrifty, she was tactical. I began to suspect, with a chilling certainty, that Maggie's poverty was entirely curated. She had deliberately chosen the fading wallpaper, the cheap car, the mismatched plates, and the coupon clipping. She wanted people to underestimate her. She wanted them to dismiss her so they would stop asking questions she had no intention of answering. Her silence was a fortress, and her apparent lack of wealth was the moat she built to keep greedy, superficial people at bay. I packed a single carry-on bag. I placed the silver coin and the 5 black notebooks securely in the center, wrapping them in a soft sweater to protect them. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dark living room, watching the streetlights cast long, shifting shadows across the worn carpet, waiting for the sun to rise. At exactly 6 o'clock the next morning, I locked the door of the Fayetteville duplex and drove directly to the airport. The security line was agonizingly slow, but I moved through the terminal with a strange, numb focus. When I finally boarded the flight, I took my seat by the window and pressed my forehead against the cool glass. The engines roared to life, a powerful, deafening sound that vibrated through my bones. As the plane lifted off the tarmac, leaving North Carolina behind, I pressed my hand against my bag. The heavy coin and the dense notebooks were right there, anchoring me to a truth I was only just beginning to understand. I looked out at the clouds gathering below. My family had spent my entire life being completely, fundamentally wrong about Margaret Hawthorne, and I was going to San Antonio to find out exactly who she really was. The Texas heat hit me like a physical wall the moment I stepped out of the airport terminal. The address on the back of my grandmother's letter brought my rental car to a sprawling, modernist campus of glass and steel on the northern edge of the city. A modest stone sign near the entrance read the name of a veteran trauma foundation. It looked like a standard medical research facility, complete with a public museum wing dedicated to military history. I walked into the main lobby, the air conditioning instantly chilling the sweat on my neck. A cheerful young woman behind a sleek white reception desk handed me a glossy brochure for the self-guided tour. I politely pushed the pamphlet back across the polished surface. "I am not here for the tour," I said, keeping my voice low. "I am looking for the private archival wing." The receptionist offered a practiced, apologetic smile. "I am sorry, ma'am. The archival wing is strictly closed to the public. Access requires prior authorization from the board of directors." I did not argue. I simply unzipped the side pocket of my leather tote bag, reached inside, and placed the heavy silver service coin on the counter. The metallic clink echoed sharply in the quiet lobby. The receptionist glanced down. The moment her eyes registered the specific insignia engraved on the tarnished silver, her practiced smile vanished completely. Her posture snapped entirely straight. She did not ask for my name. She did not ask for my identification. She picked up a landline phone, pressed a single button, and spoke exactly 3 words. "We have the coin." Less than 2 minutes later, a man in a crisp, dark suit emerged from a set of frosted glass doors. He did not ask questions either. He gestured for me to follow. We left the bright, public-facing museum behind, swiping through 3 separate electronic security checkpoints. The hallways grew narrower, the lighting cooler, the atmosphere thick with an almost reverent silence. He opened a heavy oak door at the end of a long corridor and stepped aside to let me enter. The secured conference room was vast and dimly lit, smelling faintly of old canvas and ozone. The walls were covered not with corporate art, but with massive, framed vintage battlefield maps marking elevation lines and helicopter extraction points. Glass display cases held iterations of trauma training equipment, from rudimentary canvas tourniquets to modern, high-tech hemorrhage control devices. 2 people were waiting for me at the center of a massive steel table. The woman stood up first. She wore a sharp, tailored blazer, but her ramrod straight posture and assessing gaze instantly gave away decades of military command. Beside her sat a man who looked to be in his late 60s, wearing a slightly rumpled button-down shirt, projecting the restless, intense energy of an engineer. "I am Lieutenant General Rebecca Sloan, retired," the woman said, extending a firm hand. "And this is Dr. Owen Barrett. You have Margaret's eyes. Please, sit down." I took the seat across from them, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I placed my bag on the table. "You knew my grandmother," General Sloan offered a tight, solemn nod. "Knew her. Served with her. Trusted her with the lives of my platoons more times than I can possibly count. My family always talked about her as if she just handed out aspirin in a quiet base hospital," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "They made it sound like she was a glorified clerical worker who happened to wear a uniform." Dr. Barrett let out a harsh, abrupt laugh. Though there was zero humor in it, it was a sound of profound disbelief. "Aspirin? Good God, is that truly what they thought?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the steel table. "Anna, your grandmother was not a bedside nurse. Margaret Hawthorne was one of the most elite, respected field trauma operatives in 3 different conflict zones. She did not work in sterile rooms. She worked in the dirt, in the dark, under active mortar fire. She was famous among the forward operating bases for possessing a level of calm that defied human biology." Sloan pointed toward the glass cases lining the room. "When a soldier's body is torn apart, panic is the standard human default. Panic kills just as fast as blood loss. Maggie never panicked. She was a machine of absolute, terrifying precision. We used to say she could negotiate with the Grim Reaper and win." I reached into my bag and carefully pulled out the heavy sweater. I unwrapped it, placing the 5 black waterproof field notebooks on the table. Dr. Barrett actually stopped breathing for a second. He reached out with trembling fingers, stopping just short of touching the worn leather covers. "You found them." I begged her for years to let the Foundation archive these, but she insisted on keeping them hidden. "I read some of them last night," I admitted. I did not understand all the medical terminology, but I understood the casualty notes, the timing charts. "Those are not just notes," Barrett corrected quietly. "Those books contain the foundational data for modern combat triage." Back in the 1980s, Maggie started recognizing patterns in arterial hemorrhage failure that the official military medical doctrine was completely ignoring. She began writing her own localized protocols. How to pack a wound, the exact angle of pressure, the maximum time frame before tissue death. She was innovating under fire. Sloane crossed her arms. Her handwritten protocols were so incredibly effective that commanding officers began quietly passing them between units. Eventually, the top brass caught wind of it. Maggie's field notes directly shaped the hemorrhage control standards that are now taught not just in the armed forces, but in civilian paramedic training across the entire country. I stared at the black notebooks, feeling a profound, rushing wave of awe. The woman who sat on a porch knitting an frayed wool coat had literally rewritten the rules of human survival. Why did she never say anything? Why did no one know? "Because she vehemently refused," Dr. Barrett said, his tone thick with admiration. "When the military tried to officially name the procedure the Hawthorne Protocol, she threatened to resign her commission. She refused the public medals. She refused the press interviews. She looked a 3-star general right in the eye and told him that medical work exists to save human lives, not to build a fragile human ego." Barrett stood up and walked over to one of the display cases, tapping the glass in front of a sleek black medical device. Decades later, I left the military and started a civilian medical tech company called Apex Medical. I invented a mechanized trauma device based entirely on the physics of Maggie's field observations. Without her data, my prototypes failed every single time. Her notebooks made the product viable in real-world conditions. He turned back to face me, his expression deadly serious. When Apex Medical went public and the patents were secured, I flew to North Carolina. I told Margaret I was giving her 20% founding equity in the company. I told her she was going to be a wealthy woman. I thought of the duplex, the coupon clipping, Aunt Denise mocking her outdated kitchen. "She lived on her pension," I whispered. "By choice," Sloane interjected. "Maggie accepted the equity from Owen on exactly one non-negotiable condition. The shares had to be locked in a blind trust, kept entirely private, and heavily guarded by legal non-disclosure agreements. She told us she had watched money rot the moral centers of too many good people. She knew her family, Anna," Barrett added softly. "She told me once that the people who only respect you for what you can buy them do not actually respect you at all. She refused to let my company's success change the way people treated her while she was alive. She wanted to know who would sit with her on a sagging couch, in a small house, just for the sake of her company." The immense weight of my grandmother's discipline finally crashed over me. It was not poverty. It was a perfectly executed, lifelong filter. She had built a life so outwardly unimpressive that only genuine love could possibly survive inside it, and my relatives had failed her test spectacularly, day after day, for decades. Dr. Barrett walked back to the table. He opened a slim leather folder and withdrew a single sheet of heavy, watermarked paper. He placed it directly in front of me. "Apex Medical was acquired by a global pharmaceutical conglomerate 5 years ago," Barrett explained, his voice steady and formal. "Margaret never sold a single share. They just sat in the trust, compounding, splitting, and growing." I looked down at the document. It was a certified financial statement from an elite asset management firm. I read the final bolded line at the bottom of the page. I had to read it 3 times before my brain could process the magnitude of the words printed there. The current valuation of Margaret Hawthorne's quiet, invisible trust was just over $12 million. I stared at the heavy, watermarked paper resting on the cold steel table. $12 million. The letters blurred together as a fierce pressure built behind my eyes. My lungs forgot how to draw air. For my entire life, I had believed my grandmother was a victim of a society that routinely discarded its civil servants. I had spent countless nights feeling a quiet, burning resentment on her behalf, wishing I could somehow afford to give her the luxury she so clearly deserved. Now, looking at the blinding, undeniable proof of her wealth, the fundamental truth of her existence shifted violently beneath my feet. She was never financially powerless. She was deliberately, surgically invisible. General Sloane poured a glass of ice water from a pitcher in the center of the table and slid it toward me. I took a slow sip, trying to wash down the dry, painful lump in my throat. She lived entirely on her military pension, Dr. Barrett said gently, leaning back in his chair and watching me process the shock. For 2 solid decades, she never withdrew a single dime of this trust for her own personal comfort. Not for a better car, not for a renovated kitchen, not for a vacation. Then what was the point? I asked, my voice cracking in the quiet room. Why hold on to this kind of incredible power and still wear a threadbare coat? Why let them look down on her every single day? Sloane folded her hands on the table, her posture rigid with respect. Because the money was never meant for her. Margaret viewed wealth the exact same way she viewed medical supplies on the battlefield. It was a resource to be deployed only where the bleeding was the worst. And she deployed it quietly. Barrett nodded. Opening a secondary folder, he began reading from a thick stack of disbursement logs. Instead of buying real estate or designer clothes, my grandmother had established an intricate, invisible network of financial rescue. She had quietly authorized anonymous payments to cover the mortgages of young veteran widows who were facing immediate eviction. She funded emergency nursing scholarships for brilliant students who were about to drop out due to extreme poverty. When a local military family had to travel across the country because their son was in a severe burn unit, Maggie paid for their hotel lodging for 6 straight months. She even covered the quiet, dignified burial costs for service members who died with absolutely no surviving family to claim them. She did all of it through Elias Mercer. The recipients never knew her name. They only received a formal letter from a blind trust stating that a grateful citizen had settled their debts. I buried my face in my hands, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of her secret generosity. She was saving strangers, I whispered. While her own children and grandchildren sat at a fancy restaurant yesterday and called her a pathetic failure. A heavy, uncomfortable silence descended upon the vast conference room. Dr. Barrett exchanged a loaded glance with General Sloane before closing the philanthropic ledger and pulling out a much thinner, red-tabbed file. She did not just save strangers, Anna, Barrett said, his tone dropping into a grave, serious register. That is the hardest part for you to hear today. I lowered my hands, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. What do you mean? Your grandmother knew exactly who your relatives were, Barrett continued softly. But she also knew that their financial recklessness would eventually destroy the innocent people attached to them. So, she bailed them out, repeatedly, and she never once took the credit. He opened the red file and slid the first document across the table. It was a bank transfer receipt dated 8 years ago. Aunt Denise, I breathed, reading the name on the foreclosure rescue notice. Denise was 90 days away from losing her home during her messy divorce, Barrett explained. She was parading around the country club, acting like she was perfectly fine, while her bank was preparing the final eviction papers. Margaret authorized Elias to quietly buy the debt and restructure it through a shell corporation, so Denise and her children would not end up on the street. Denise thinks a miraculous corporate investor saved her. I felt physically sick. Just yesterday, Denise had mocked the Fayetteville duplex and joked about Maggie waiting for the depression. Barrett slid another paper forward. Uncle Randall, 6 years ago, he accumulated a massive, dangerous gambling debt with some very unsavory private lenders. He was about to lose his business and potentially his freedom. Margaret paid it off in full. Randall believes a clerical error and a lucky statute of limitations wiped his slate clean. There were more. I saw the massive tuition gap payment that allowed my cousin Brooke to graduate from her elite private university without a mountain of high-interest student loans. Brooke, who had just sneered that patriotism did not pay, had her entire pristine future funded by the very woman she actively despised. Then I saw the residential deposit for my cousin Nolan. When his addiction spiraled out of control and his parents refused to acknowledge the problem out of sheer embarrassment, Maggie anonymously paid for 90 days at a top-tier rehabilitation facility. Every single person who had laughed at her thrift had been secretly propped up by her money. Why? I asked, tears finally spilling over my lashes and tracing hot, wet lines down my cheeks. Why would she keep helping people who treated her like absolute garbage? Why not just tell them the truth and demand the basic respect she had earned? Sloane stood up and walked over to the glass display case containing Maggie's old canvas tourniquets. She stared at the rough fabric for a long moment before turning back to me. Because she understood human nature better than anyone I have ever met, Sloane said, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. I asked her the exact same question once, years ago. I asked why she let them treat her like a burden. Maggie looked at me and said, "The fastest way to be used is to let selfish people know exactly what you have." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. She knew that if she revealed her wealth, your relatives would never stop hounding her. Sloane continued, her eyes locked onto mine. Every conversation would become a negotiation. Every holiday would become a pitch for a loan. They would stop seeing a mother or a grandmother, and they would only see a bank vault. By hiding the money, she protected her peace. She helped them only when it was a matter of actual survival, and she did it from the shadows so they could not attach themselves to her out of pure, unadulterated greed. I sat back in my chair, staring blindly at the ceiling. What my family had loudly labeled as weakness was actually a masterful defensive strategy. Maggie had stayed outwardly modest, absorbing their daily insults, so their greed would continuously show its true face. She had essentially given them just enough room to let their own arrogance undo them. She knew them intimately, not by what they demanded from her, but by how they treated her when they believed she had absolutely nothing to offer them. A soft, electronic chime interrupted the heavy silence in the room. Dr. Barrett walked over to the large media screen mounted on the far wall and tapped a few keys on a control panel. The screen flickered to life, displaying the severe, composed face of Elias Mercer, calling in from his downtown Charlotte office. "Good afternoon, Dr. Barrett, General Sloane," Elias said formally through the high-definition speakers. His dark eyes shifted toward the center of the camera. "Anna, I assume you have seen the ledgers." "I have seen them," I replied, my voice sounding hollow and strange to my own ears. "I have seen all of it." "Good," Elias said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Then it is time to discuss the actual mechanics of the trust. Your grandmother did not just leave behind $12 million. Anna, she left behind a very specific set of legal instructions regarding the future of that capital." I wiped my face with the back of my hand, forcing myself to sit up straighter and meet his steady gaze through the screen. "Instructions for what?" Elias leaned forward, his expression hardening into something fiercely protective. "Your relatives are currently tearing through that house in Fayetteville, assuming they are entitled to split the remaining scraps of a small, pathetic estate. They believe they are firmly in charge of the narrative." He paused, letting the immense weight of the moment settle over the secure connection. "They are incorrect," Elias stated clearly. "Margaret structured this trust so that absolutely no one in your extended family has any legal authority over her assets. She placed the entire burden and the absolute power squarely onto you. You are the sole primary beneficiary, Anna, and you are the sole trustee. When the time comes to finally reveal this estate, you alone will dictate exactly what happens to every single one of them." The flight back to North Carolina felt entirely surreal. I carried a secret capable of leveling my entire family tree. Yet I walked through the airport terminal wearing the exact same exhausted expression I had worn since the funeral. That was the strategy Elias and I had agreed upon before I even left Texas. I would return to the duplex, say absolutely nothing about the trust, and simply watch. I would give them an empty stage and let them perform. It took exactly 48 hours for the masks to slip completely. Aunt Denise cornered me on a Tuesday morning. She arrived at the duplex holding 2 cups of expensive artisan coffee, wearing a cashmere sweater and a deeply practiced expression of maternal concern. She sat me down at the small kitchen table, reached across the scratched formica, and gently patted my hand. "You look terrible, sweetheart," Denise murmured, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "This whole process is taking a severe toll on you. I was talking to Tyler, and we all agree that you are simply too emotional right now to handle the crushing administrative burden of an estate." She smoothly slid a crisp legal document across the table. It was a formal renunciation of executor duties, pre-filled and waiting for my signature. "Just sign this," she urged softly. "Let me take the wheel. The house is a liability. The accounts are likely overdrawn, and dealing with creditors will only break your heart further. You need to grieve. Let the adults handle the messy business." I stared at the paper, marveling at her audacity. She was using my genuine grief as a weapon to strip away my legal control, all while framing it as a profound act of charity. I did not raise my voice. I simply slid the paper back to her, stating quietly that I needed more time to read through the fine print. Denise left with her jaw clenched, the maternal warmth vanishing the very second she realized I was not going to blindly obey. By Thursday afternoon, Tyler decided to escalate the campaign. He did not bother knocking when he entered the house, strutting through the front door as if he already held the deed. He dropped a thick, professionally bound proposal onto the coffee table. "I pulled some major strings," Tyler announced, adjusting his silk tie with a self-satisfied smirk. "The real estate market is brutal right now for distressed properties. But I convinced a private investment group to take this crumbling duplex off our hands for a flat cash offer, no inspections, no closing costs. It is a clean break." I opened the folder. He was proposing a lightning-fast transfer to a newly formed limited liability company. The purchase price listed was roughly 40% below the actual market value of the land alone. I recognized the registered address of the corporate entity immediately. It was the exact same address as a boutique consulting firm owned by Tyler's college roommate. He was attempting to secretly flip my grandmother's home to his own business partner for pennies, effectively stealing the core asset of the estate right out from under the family. "I will think about it," I told him, keeping my expression perfectly blank. Tyler scoffed, visibly annoyed by my lack of overwhelming gratitude. "Do not think too long. Offers like this expire in 24 hours. You are not going to find a better bailout." The sheer greed was bad enough, but the blatant disrespect for the physical space was worse. The next morning, I pulled into the driveway to find Uncle Randall's heavy-duty pickup truck backed right up to the front porch. The front door was propped wide open. I walked inside to find Randall unbolting a beautiful antique oak workbench that my grandmother had kept in the garage for decades. A pile of vintage hand tools, a set of silver cutlery, and a handcrafted cedar rocking chair were already loaded into the bed of his truck. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked, standing in the doorway. Randall did not even bother to look up from his wrench. "Consolidating," he grunted. "This house is going to be a free-for-all once the junk removal guys get here. I am taking the items of actual value for safekeeping. I am the son. I have seniority here. I deserve first pick of the heirlooms, not just the sentimental granddaughter." He was stripping the house bare, stealing physical memories simply because he felt entitled to a better payout. He walked right past me carrying a heavy box of tools, completely dismissing my presence. I did not try to physically stop him. Instead, I stood on the porch and discreetly used my phone to record a clear, continuous video of him loading the stolen assets into his vehicle and driving away. The final, most absurd insult arrived over the weekend. I returned from a quick trip to the grocery store to find 2 strangers standing in the living room, aggressively pointing at the faded floral wallpaper and making notes on a digital tablet. I demanded to know who they were. The woman holding the tablet looked at me with deep annoyance, explaining that Brooke had hired her to scout the location. My cousin, apparently, had decided that the peeling paint, the worn hardwood floors, and the musty atmosphere possessed a trendy, rustic aesthetic. Brooke had formally scheduled a professional design team to strip the living room and stage it for an editorial bridal photo shoot, claiming the house had perfect vintage military core charm. She intended to use the aesthetic of my grandmother's perceived poverty as a quirky backdrop for her luxury wedding campaign. I forced the designers out of the house immediately, locking the door behind them. Behind the scenes, I was not merely suffering through these indignities. Every single day, Elias and I meticulously documented the onslaught. We built a heavily encrypted digital file. We logged the exact dates and times of the unauthorized entries. We saved the drafted legal documents Tyler tried to force upon me, creating a clear paper trail of his attempted asset diversion. We cataloged the high-pressure tactics, the verbal abuse, and the easily disprovable, false statements they made regarding the financial status of the estate. The trap was being laid, brick by brick, using their own actions as the mortar. In the quiet, lonely hours of the night, when the house was finally empty, I sat at the small kitchen table and read the private letters Maggie had tucked between the pages of her medical notebooks. Her foresight was genuinely terrifying. The letters proved that she had anticipated their exact maneuvers with chilling accuracy. She knew Denise would try to hijack the legal process under the guise of fake maternal concern. She predicted Randall would feel entitled to physically loot the property. She even warned me that the younger generation would treat her legacy as a cheap commodity. One particular letter was written on heavy, cream-colored stationery. The ink was dark and deliberate. "Do not intervene too early. Anna," her elegant handwriting instructed, "let them believe they have won. Let them think the house is empty and the bank accounts are dry. Never reveal the trust until they have made their choices entirely of their own free will." People tell the absolute truth about themselves when they think there is nothing to gain and no one powerful watching. She was right. Stripped of the expectation of a massive inheritance, my family had rapidly devolved into scavengers. They were proving, in real time, exactly why she had hidden the money in the first place. By the end of the second week, I thought I had seen the absolute bottom of their depravity. I was wrong. I was sitting in Elias's downtown office, reviewing the latest timeline of events, when his paralegal knocked sharply and handed him a freshly printed court docket alert. Elias read the single page, his jaw tightening into a hard, unforgiving line. He slowly slid the paper across his desk so I could read it. Tyler had not just been making verbal threats and drafting fake real estate proposals. Behind my back, utilizing a loophole in the county filing system, he had quietly submitted preliminary legal paperwork to the probate court. It was a preemptive strike. He was formally challenging any future administrative decision that might exclude his fiancée, Brooke, and his future mother-in-law, Denise, from seizing control of the property. He had officially weaponized the legal system against me, completely unaware that he had just signed his own professional and financial death warrant. The quiet observation phase was officially over. It was time to close the jaws of the trap. The black leather binder on Elias Mercer's desk was thicker than a dictionary. When he finally opened it, the distinct scent of heavy parchment and aged ink filled the room. We were no longer simply observing my family's bad behavior. We were officially prosecuting it. Elias smoothed his hand over the top page. "Your grandmother did not just leave behind $12 million, he began, his voice taking on the sharp, precise cadence of a courtroom litigator. She constructed a fortress. The Hawthorne Trust is divided into 3 highly specific, insulated layers: personal, charitable, and conditional. He turned the first few pages, outlining the personal component. I was named the primary beneficiary of a major portion of the liquid assets, securing my financial independence for the rest of my life. But the wealth was not just handed to me as a blank check. It came with a profound responsibility. The second layer established 2 massive philanthropic entities, a nursing scholarship fund and a comprehensive veterans emergency housing branch, both created in Maggie's name. I was granted 100% executive authority over their operations and disbursements. Then, Elias flipped to the third section of the binder, the conditional layer. He reached into a secondary drawer and produced 4 individual manila envelopes. Each one was sealed with red wax and bore the name of a specific relative written in my grandmother's unmistakable, looping handwriting. Denise, Randall, Brooke, Nolan. Every single family member who received silent financial salvation from Margaret has a dedicated accounting file, Elias explained, tapping the thickest envelope, which belonged to my aunt. Inside these packets are the exact dates of transfer, the precise dollar amounts, and handwritten notes from Margaret, proving that the funds were dispensed strictly to stabilize their lives during moments of critical, self-inflicted ruin. I stared at the envelopes, realizing they were not just ledgers. They were absolute proof of their hypocrisy. Margaret did leave them each a modest final bequest, Elias continued, his dark eyes meeting mine. A lump sum designed to be a final gesture of goodwill. However, those bequests were chained to an ironclad behavior clause. They would only receive the money if they accepted the estate peacefully. He leaned forward, clearly savoring the forensic brilliance of his late client. The stipulations are aggressively clear. The beneficiaries forfeit every single penny if they slander you, if they attempt to seize physical property before a formal inventory is completed, or if they contest the trust in bad faith. I thought about the video on my phone of Randall stealing the antique workbench. I thought about Denise trying to manipulate me into signing away my rights. There is more, Elias said softly. He opened a slim side folder and slid 2 yellowed pieces of paper across the desk. When Margaret bailed out Denise's mortgage and Randall's gambling debts years ago, she did not simply write a check. She required them to sign promissory acknowledgments, legally binding documents confirming they received the bailouts. My jaw tightened as I recognized their signatures at the bottom of the pages. They thought she destroyed these. They assumed she was too soft to keep the receipts, Elias corrected. They were wrong. These documents legally validate the prior disbursements, ensuring that neither Denise nor Randall can ever claim they were unfairly excluded from the primary estate. They already took their inheritance early. I sat back in my chair, the sheer, staggering weight of Maggie's preparations settling over me. She had anticipated their greed so perfectly that she had woven their own past mistakes into a strict legal net. "What about Tyler?" I asked, remembering the court docket alert Elias had just handed me. He filed that preliminary paperwork to challenge the probate process on Brooke's behalf. A cold, predatory smile touched the corners of Elias's mouth. It was a terrifying expression on such a refined man. Tyler Wynn is a junior associate who severely overestimates his own intelligence. By quietly filing that preemptive challenge at the courthouse, he unknowingly triggered the bad faith contest clause. Elias tapped his silver pen against the desk for emphasis. Tyler did not secure a tactical advantage. He walked directly into a trap. His legal maneuvering automatically suspended Brooke's final bequest, pending a full judicial review. In his arrogant attempt to steal control, he just froze his own fiancée's inheritance. A fierce, sharp thrill shot through my chest. The very weapon they tried to use against me had backfired with devastating precision. But Elias was not finished. He turned to the final tab in the master binder, pulling out a certified property deed. "The most crucial detail concerns the real estate," Elias said, his tone softening slightly. "Tyler wants to transfer the Fayetteville duplex to his business partner. Randall is looting the garage. Brooke wants to use the living room for a trendy bridal photo shoot. They are fighting over an asset that does not belong to them." I frowned in confusion. But Maggie owned the house. Maggie transferred the deed into the trust over 5 years ago, Elias explained. The duplex is completely immune to probate. It is not a leftover asset for them to divide and sell. It is the cornerstone of the charitable branch. He slid the deed toward me, revealing the specific zoning and operational designations attached to the property address. "Your grandmother explicitly designated that duplex to become a fully funded transitional housing facility," Elias told me, his voice thick with reverence. "It will serve exclusively as a safe haven for military nursing families who are facing sudden, severe financial crises." It will be renovated, staffed, and maintained by the trust in perpetuity. I closed my eyes as a wave of overwhelming, painful irony washed over me. I remembered Brooke standing in the cemetery in her custom black silk dress, calling the house a crumbling testament to poverty. I remembered Denise mocking the old kitchen. I remembered all the years they sneered at the peeling paint and the cheap floor wax. The shabby little home they relentlessly mocked was not a symbol of failure. It was a chrysalis. It was destined to outlive every single one of them. Long after their country club memberships expired and their luxury cars rusted in junkyards, Margaret Hawthorne's modest duplex would stand as a monument of absolute grace, sheltering the very people my family viewed as entirely disposable. "They are going to panic," I whispered, opening my eyes and looking at the mountain of legal ammunition spread across the desk. "When you mail them the notices of suspension and the deed transfer, they are going to lose their minds." Elias closed the heavy binder with a definitive, satisfying thud. "I can draft the notification letters this afternoon. We can handle this quietly, entirely behind closed doors. They will be furious, but they will be legally powerless to stop it." I looked out the large window of the downtown office, watching the heavy gray clouds gathering over the city skyline. I thought about the decades of silent endurance my grandmother had suffered. I thought about the cruel jokes, the condescending sighs, and the absolute lack of respect they showed her, even as she secretly saved them from their own ruin. Handling this quietly behind closed doors was exactly what they relied on. They relied on politeness to shield their viciousness. "No," I said, my voice ringing out with a newfound, unshakable clarity. Elias raised an eyebrow, waiting for my instruction. "We are not mailing them anything," I decided. Standing up from my chair, I felt a cold, brilliant fire igniting in my veins. Maggie stayed quiet her entire life so they could show their true colors. Now that we have the proof, I refuse to let them hide behind a confidential legal settlement. I am not going to simply defend this trust from the shadows. I placed my hand flat against the leather binder. "File the injunction against Randall for the stolen property. Answer Tyler's challenge on the public record. Submit the promissory notes into open discovery. I want to force the entire truth into the blinding daylight, in a venue where none of them can ever rewrite the narrative." Tyler Wynn was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. When his initial probate challenge was met with absolute, stony silence from our side, he sensed the immediate shift in the atmosphere. He realized I was not rushing to the negotiation table to beg for a compromise. He knew I was withholding something significant, because a vacuum of information terrifies people who are used to being in control. My family immediately pivoted from passive aggression to open warfare. The smear campaign began within 48 hours. Aunt Denise weaponized her extensive country club telephone tree, calling every distant relative, family friend, and local gossip she could find. She spun a tragic, entirely fictional narrative to anyone who would listen. She claimed that I had maliciously isolated my grandmother during her final 6 months of life, screening her phone calls and barring visitors. She painted me as an unstable, manipulative granddaughter who had brainwashed a frail old woman just to control the estate. Her goal was incredibly transparent. She hoped the intense social pressure and the embarrassing family gossip would terrify me into agreeing to a quick, quiet settlement just to make the whispering stop. Brooke took her grievances straight to the public square. She posted a lengthy, tearful diatribe on her social media accounts, complaining to her hundreds of followers that her greedy cousin was destroying their beautiful family over a dead woman's worthless furniture. It took every ounce of my willpower not to laugh out loud at the profound, catastrophic irony of her post. She was publicly crying over stained upholstery and outdated wood cabinets, completely unaware she had just forfeited a multi-million-dollar inheritance by violating the terms of a trust she did not even know existed. Then came the formal legal escalation. Tyler filed an aggressive petition with the county court to completely invalidate any existing estate documents. His core argument was as insulting as it was predictable. He formally argued that my grandmother had been severely mentally compromised for the last 5 years of her life. He cited her modest lifestyle, her refusal to upgrade her appliances, and her supposed paranoia about banks as definitive proof of cognitive decline. He expected me to panic. He assumed I would be terrified of the exorbitant legal fees required to fight a prolonged competency battle in court, forcing me to capitulate and hand over the keys. He vastly underestimated both of us. He also entirely forgot what I did for a living. I spent my days working as a senior compliance auditor for a massive corporate logistics firm. I did not panic under pressure. I organized data. I treated my treacherous family exactly like a corrupt corporation that needed to be dismantled piece by piece. My professional background became the ultimate weapon. Elias and I did not just answer Tyler's frivolous filing. We buried it under an absolute avalanche of undeniable, empirical proof. I spent 4 consecutive days building immaculate timelines, cross-referencing text messages, assembling access records, and establishing flawless chain of custody logs for every single document in the house. We submitted perfectly clean neurological evaluations conducted every 6 months by a top-tier geriatric specialist. We handed over comprehensive therapy notes, detailing my grandmother's sharp, entirely lucid conversations about her charitable goals. The finishing blow was a high-definition video recording from 3 years ago. It showed my grandmother sitting in Elias's conference room, flawlessly articulating the exact complex legal terms of her trust, while verbally identifying her relative's financially reckless habits with terrifying accuracy. She was not just legally competent, she was formidable, organized, and light years ahead of them. But the true fracture in their alliance happened when we dropped a brand new bombshell into the discovery file. During his frantic scramble to assess the physical property, Tyler had missed a crucial, devastating detail. 2 years ago, after noticing items being moved around in her home during family visits, my grandmother had Elias hire a private security firm to install 2 microscopic, motion-activated cameras hidden inside the living room and hallway smoke detectors. The security footage we handed over to the court was pristine. It showed Uncle Randall standing in the middle of the duplex, not just stealing the antique tools I had caught him taking earlier, but actively prying open my grandmother's personal filing cabinet with a crowbar. The audio was crystal clear. Randall had his cell phone on speaker. Tyler's voice echoed through the empty house, explicitly directing Randall to search for life insurance policies, hidden cash, or bearer bonds. Tyler was caught on tape instructing him to remove any confidential documents before the court could conduct a formal inventory. Elias scheduled a mandatory pretrial conference, forcing all of them into a sterile deposition room at his law firm. The moment we played the security video on the projector screen, all the oxygen left the room. Tyler went completely pale, his smug, practiced legal confidence evaporating into a cold sweat. He knew immediately that he was looking at severe professional sanctions, if not total disbarment. Randall panicked under the intense pressure of being caught committing a felony on tape. He stammered, lied about the date of the recording, and then immediately changed his story to claim he was only looking for a sentimental photograph. When Elias calmly pointed out the audio of him reading bank routing numbers aloud to Tyler, Randall broke completely. Desperate to save himself from criminal charges, he slammed his hand on the table and loudly blamed Denise. He shouted that the entire raid was her idea because she desperately needed cash to cover a massive, overdrawn credit line she had been hiding from her new boyfriend. In less than 60 seconds, the unbreakable family alliance shattered into jagged pieces. Denise shrieked that Randall was a liar and a thief. Tyler tried to legally distance himself from both of them, claiming he was only offering informal advice as a concerned friend, which only made Brooke scream at him for abandoning her mother. They were viciously tearing each other apart before we even reached the courtroom. The probate judge reviewed our colossal stack of evidence, the compliance logs, and the damning security footage. Disgusted by Tyler's frivolous, bad faith filing and the blatant, documented attempt to steal estate property, the judge refused to dismiss the case quietly into mediation. Instead, he ordered a full mandatory evidentiary hearing on the public record. It was the absolute worst-case scenario for a family that worshipped their country club reputation and relied on keeping their ugly secrets buried. But for me, It was perfect. The judge had just handed me the exact, brightly lit public forum that my grandmother's truth had been waiting for. The formal discovery phase of a lawsuit is a brutal, forensic autopsy of a person's life. Once the judge ordered a full evidentiary hearing, Elias and I legally compelled my family to surrender their financial histories. They had spent their entire lives treating my grandmother like an embarrassing beggar. Now, under the threat of perjury, they had to swear on the public record exactly how much of her money they had secretly taken. Because Tyler had filed a bad faith contest regarding my grandmother's mental competence, he unwittingly opened the door for us to examine their financial motives. Elias issued subpoenas for their bank records. The hypocrisy we legally codified was staggering. Aunt Denise had built an entire social identity around being a fierce, self-made woman. She hosted charity galas at her country club and constantly bragged about her pristine credit. But the subpoenaed records, when matched against the promissory notes Elias held in the trust binder, legally dismantled her facade. The documents proved that while she was hiding a disastrous divorce from her wealthy friends, she was secretly taking massive wire transfers from the very woman she publicly mocked for clipping coupons. We forced Denise to formally admit in her deposition that her country club dues were effectively subsidized by a retired Army nurse. The financial freeze Tyler initiated completely destroyed his own personal life. By legally contesting the estate, he triggered an automatic hold on all asset distributions. My cousin Brooke had been recklessly spending money for months, banking entirely on a massive, immediate payout from selling the Fayetteville duplex to fund her upcoming luxury wedding. With the estate locked down in litigation, their cash flow evaporated overnight. Brooke's frantic emails to Tyler became part of the discovery file. She was terrified. Her high-end florists were demanding their final deposits. The luxury venue was threatening to cancel her reservation. Tyler had tried to orchestrate a quick, dirty estate grab to finance his own lavish lifestyle, and in doing so, he had financially suffocated his future bride. While Elias handled the aggressive legal maneuvers downtown, I spent my evenings at the duplex, methodically boxing up the remaining physical items. Deep inside a hall closet, tucked beneath a stack of old winter blankets, I found a small, outdated digital voice recorder. I sat on the worn living room carpet and pressed the play button. The device was filled with dozens of unsent audio memos. They were not messages for anyone else. They were simply my grandmother talking to herself in the quiet, lonely hours of the night. Her voice was raspy, tired, but remarkably steady. Listening to those recordings was the most devastating experience of my life. I heard Maggie wrestle with the agonizing paradox of her own generosity. In one recording, dated just a few months after she paid off Uncle Randall's staggering gambling debts, she spoke about the harsh reality of saving selfish people. "They absolutely despise the feeling of dependence," Maggie said softly into the microphone, the audio crackling slightly with static. "They hate that they need me, but they feel entirely entitled to the rescue." Randall could not even look me in the eye when I handed Elias the authorization. He just took the clearance and then complained about the brand of tea I offered him. I know they laugh at my clothes. I know they call my house a dump. I hear them whisper when they think I'm sleeping in the next room. I gripped the edge of the coffee table, tears blurring my vision. She knew. She knew exactly how little respect she was getting. She absorbed their cruelty. She documented their absolute lack of gratitude, and she chose to deploy kindness anyway. She did not help them because she was weak or ignorant. She helped them because her discipline was stronger than their arrogance. The profound weight of her quiet endurance cut me like a physical blade. I wiped my face and immediately called Elias. I told him we were no longer just defending the trust. We were going on the offensive. We reached out to Texas. General Rebecca Sloan and Dr. Owen Barrett did not hesitate for a single second. They immediately agreed to provide sworn, notarized affidavits detailing Margaret Hawthorne's immense medical influence, her massive business equity, and her decades of quiet, localized philanthropy. They went a step further, formally offering to fly to North Carolina to testify in person at the evidentiary hearing. The military and medical communities were ready to stand behind her. I also made a final decision regarding the black waterproof field notebooks. Originally, I had thought of them as deeply personal, sentimental relics to be kept hidden away. But reading Tyler's condescending court filings, which painted my grandmother as a confused, paranoid old woman, ignited a fierce, protective rage inside me. I drove to Elias's office the next morning and placed the 5 black notebooks directly onto his mahogany desk. I instructed him to formally enter them into the public court record as Exhibit A. They were not diaries. They were clinical, professional proof that Margaret Hawthorne possessed a brilliant, mathematically precise mind that had fundamentally altered modern trauma care. I wanted the judge, the lawyers, and every single member of my family to physically see the intricate, life-saving protocols she invented while dodging mortar fire. The sheer volume of our evidence terrified opposing counsel. Tyler's law firm realized they were marching straight into a professional massacre, 48 hours before the scheduled court date. Tyler made one final, desperate play. He requested a private meeting at a neutral coffee shop. He arrived looking exhausted, his designer suit slightly wrinkled, the signature smugness completely wiped from his face. He slid a crisp, heavily redacted document across the small table. "It is a confidential settlement agreement," Tyler said, his voice dropping into a tense, urgent whisper. "Anna, look at this logically. If we go into that courtroom on Friday, it is going to be an absolute bloodbath. Denise's financial history will be a matter of public record. Randall will likely face an indictment for the attempted theft. Brooke is having daily panic attacks about the wedding. You hold all the cards. I concede." I looked down at the paper but did not touch it. "What are you offering?" "Total capitulation on the competency challenge," Tyler replied quickly, leaning forward. "We withdraw the filing completely. We agree not to contest the philanthropic charities. We will walk away from the duplex entirely. All I am asking is that you seal the discovery documents, bury the security footage, sign a non-disclosure agreement to keep the family embarrassment out of the press, and legally split the primary liquid control of the estate equally with Brooke. You both walk away incredibly wealthy, and the family name survives intact." He was trying to buy my silence. He genuinely believed that if he offered me a fast, guaranteed payout, I would prioritize my own bank account over my grandmother's honor. He thought everyone had a price because he had a price. I looked at Tyler Wynn. I saw a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of power, completely broken by a woman who had built her entire life on actual strength. "No," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any hesitation. Tyler blinked, genuinely shocked. "Anna, be reasonable. We are talking about millions of dollars. You do not want to drag your own blood through a public trial." "You dragged her first," I reminded him coldly. "You called her incompetent. Brooke called her a failure. Denise called her an embarrassment. You all assumed her silence was permission to trample her legacy." I stood up, leaving his pathetic settlement offer sitting on the table. "The money does not matter to me anymore, Tyler," I said, looking down at him. $12 million is nothing compared to restoring the full, undeniable weight of Margaret Hawthorne's name. I will see you in court on Friday, and I am going to make sure every single person in that room knows exactly who you people really are." Friday morning arrived with a cold, biting wind, but the interior of the county courthouse was stifling. The courtroom felt too small for the sheer volume of truth about to be unleashed. My family sat on the opposing side of the heavy oak aisle. Aunt Denise wore a severe gray suit, furiously gripping a shredded tissue. Uncle Randall stared at the scuffed floor, sweating profusely through his collar. Cousin Brooke looked utterly hollowed out, while Tyler Wynn sat rigidly beside his own terrified defense counsel. I sat at the petitioner table next to Elias Mercer, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I did not fidget. I did not glare. I simply watched them face the inescapable machinery of justice they had so arrogantly invoked. The judge, a stern man with zero tolerance for probate nonsense, called the evidentiary hearing to order at exactly 9 o'clock, Our first witness was Dr. Owen Barrett. When the brilliant medical inventor took the stand, the sheer gravity of his presence immediately shifted the room. Under Elias's careful questioning, Dr. Barrett explained my grandmother's legacy in plain, undeniable language. He pointed directly to the 5 black waterproof notebooks entered into evidence. He described how a frontline Army nurse, operating in the mud and the blood of active war zones, had meticulously charted the precise mathematics of human survival. He looked directly at Tyler and explained that Margaret Hawthorne was not a confused, paranoid woman hoarding useless junk in a dilapidated house. She was a pioneering trauma architect. My civilian medical company generated billions of dollars, Dr. Barrett testified, his voice ringing against the wood-paneled walls. But the medical devices we sold were entirely useless without Margaret's foundational triage data. Her field observations saved countless lives. I gave her 20% founding equity not out of charity, but because it was her absolute, earned right. She held a patent on human survival. General Rebecca Sloan was called next. She took the oath with a crisp, intimidating military precision that made Uncle Randall visibly shrink down into his chair. Elias asked why a woman of such staggering historical importance had no public medals displayed in her home, a fact Tyler had foolishly cited in his filings as proof of her insignificance. Because Margaret Hawthorne actively refused them, General Sloan answered, her sharp gaze sweeping across my horrified relatives. She turned down the commendation ceremonies. She declined the press interviews. She rejected the ceremonial honors because she firmly believed that service was a solemn duty, not a theatrical performance for the ego. She did not need a piece of ribbon to validate the breath returning to a dying soldier's lungs. She knew exactly who she was. With the myth of my grandmother's insignificance completely obliterated, Elias moved on to the brutal financial reality. He approached the bench and formally introduced the sealed accounting packets. The judge reviewed the files in silence, his expression darkening with every page he turned. Elias then turned to the gallery and systematically dismantled my family's remaining dignity. He exposed the devastating fact that the very same people who laughed at an old woman's thrift had been privately begging for her money for years. Aunt Denise broke first. As Elias outlined the massive anonymous corporate payout that saved her home from foreclosure, she stood up from her wooden bench, her face flushed with a desperate, ugly panic. "I meant well," Denise cried out, her carefully crafted high society facade shattering completely into pieces. "I was drowning in debt. My husband left me with nothing. She was my mother. She was supposed to help me, but she made me feel so small." The judge slammed his gavel, ordering her to sit down immediately or face a contempt charge. Elias did not argue with her outburst. He simply picked up a yellowed piece of paper and read her signed promissory acknowledgement aloud into the court record, word for verbatim word. He read the part where Denise legally swore she had received the bailout and would never attempt to extract another dime from the estate. The heavy silence that followed his reading was absolutely suffocating. It only got worse from there. The judge formally reviewed the hidden security footage from the Fayetteville duplex. Uncle Randall's blatant theft of the antique tools and his attempt to pry open the filing cabinet was established as an undisputed fact on the record. The judge then stared down at Tyler Wynn with a look of absolute professional disgust. For filing a bad faith competency contest, orchestrating the physical removal of estate assets, and attempting a fraudulent real estate transfer to a business partner, the judge announced he was issuing immediate, severe financial sanctions against Tyler. Furthermore, the judge stated on the record that he was referring Tyler's conduct directly to the State Bar Association for a comprehensive disciplinary review. Tyler buried his face in his hands, his arrogant legal career effectively incinerated in a matter of minutes. Beside him, Brooke finally realized the catastrophic scope of her own arrogance. She stared at the financial ledgers displayed on the court monitors, seeing the exact, massive dollar amounts that had paid for her elite college tuition. Her glamorous, pristine future, the luxury wedding she had prioritized over her grandmother's memory, had been entirely built upon the silent grace of the woman she had mercilessly mocked. The realization physically doubled her over in her seat. She sobbed openly, not for the lost inheritance she had banked on, but from the crushing, undeniable weight of her own profound shame. She finally understood that her entire life was a charity case funded by a hero she treated like garbage. Through the entire grueling 3-hour spectacle, I remained perfectly composed. The opposing defense attorney barely attempted to cross-examine me, and when the judge asked me direct questions regarding the timeline of events, I answered with brief, polite, purely factual statements. I did not raise my voice once. I did not hurl insults at my aunt or my uncle. My absolute calm made their messy, loud, public collapse feel even more brutal. I was a quiet mirror reflecting their unchecked greed back at them, and they could not stand the sight of their own hideous reflections. As the hearing finally reached its conclusion, Elias stood at the podium one last time. He asked the court's permission to read the final, personal statement Margaret Hawthorne had attached to the master trust document. The judge granted the request, leaning forward to listen. "My client left these words for this exact moment," Elias said, his voice carrying a deep, resonant sorrow that filled the quiet room. He opened the heavy, cream-colored stationery. She wrote, "I did not hide my money because I was ashamed of having it. I hid my wealth because I wanted to know who could love me without it. I wanted to see who would sit at my scratched kitchen table and treat me with the basic dignity of a human being, rather than the utility of a bank account. I leave this world knowing exactly who failed that test, and who passed it with flying colors. Let the consequences fall exactly where they have been earned." The judge did not hesitate for a single second. He struck down the competency challenge with extreme prejudice. He legally upheld the Hawthorne Trust in its absolute entirety, confirming my position as the sole trustee and primary beneficiary. He ruthlessly enforced the penalty clauses, permanently stripping Denise, Randall, and Brooke of their final financial bequests due to their blatant, documented violations of the peaceable acceptance terms. It was a total, absolute legal victory. My family walked out of the courtroom with absolutely nothing. Their country club reputations were completely destroyed. Their ugly financial secrets were permanently exposed on the public record, and their pockets were entirely empty. Elias packed the heavy leather binders into his briefcase, offering me a rare, genuine smile of profound respect. We had won the battle exactly as we had planned, utilizing nothing but the truth and their own awful choices. But as I walked out of the heavy oak doors and stepped into the bright afternoon sun, I knew the story was not completely resolved just yet. I had one final act left to execute. They had faced the brutal legal consequences of their actions, but they still needed to face the physical reality of her enduring legacy. It had been exactly 5 days since the heavy wooden gavel fell in the county courthouse, sealing the fate of my family. Despite the absolute financial and legal devastation that had rained down upon them, my relatives possessed a terrifying, almost pathological capacity for denial. The invitation to Brooke's lavish rehearsal dinner arrived in my inbox with a subject line enthusiastically suggesting family healing and new beginnings. The event was held in the private, glass-enclosed atrium of a luxury country club, complete with imported white orchids, a classical string quartet, and waiters circulating with silver trays of expensive appetizers. They expected me to show up looking defensive, or perhaps they hoped I would not show up at all. They desperately wanted to reclaim the social narrative, to smile for the wealthy extended family and pretend the brutal trial was just a minor, unfortunate misunderstanding over a small inheritance. I arrived precisely on time. I did not wear mourning clothes, nor did I try to blend into the background. I wore a tailored, midnight blue silk dress that caught the soft, golden lighting of the crystal chandeliers. I walked into the crowded room feeling perfectly calm, entirely elegant, and utterly impossible for them to dismiss. I stood near the edge of the room and watched them scramble. Tyler Wynne looked physically ill. He was nursing a dark scotch, while aggressively avoiding eye contact with the few remaining corporate lawyers in the room who had not yet heard about his pending disbarment review. Brooke was forcing a tight, visibly panicked smile. I knew from Elias, that 3 of her premium wedding vendors had just threatened to walk out and cancel their services unless they were paid in full by midnight, a financial impossibility now that her inheritance was permanently gone. Aunt Denise spotted me and immediately hurried over, attempting to corner me near a towering champagne display. She reached out, trying to grasp my arm with a trembling, manicured hand, whispering frantically that we needed to put the ugliness behind us. She suggested we announce a private truce to the guests to save face. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl a single insult at her. I simply picked up a crystal flute, tapped it sharply with a silver spoon, and stepped toward the center of the room. The high, clear chime silenced the murmuring crowd instantly. Dozens of faces turned toward me. I looked directly at Denise, then shifted my gaze to Brooke, and finally locked eyes with Tyler. I raised my glass slightly and announced to the entire room that the Hawthorne Military Nursing House and the Margaret Hawthorne Trauma Scholarship would officially launch to the public at 8 o'clock the next morning. A wave of confused whispers rippled through the guests who were entirely unaware of the trial and the $12 million trust. I let the heavy silence stretch out before revealing the physical location of the new charitable facility. I told the crowd, in a voice as smooth and cold as ice, that the very first renovated building was my grandmother's former duplex in Fayetteville. I watched my family flinch as I explained how the poor little place they had relentlessly mocked, the house they had confidently called a crumbling testament to poverty, had been completely transformed. It was now a permanent, fully funded refuge for military families facing sudden, catastrophic medical crises. I did not stop there. I confirmed, with absolute, chilling clarity, the final legal status of the estate, so there could be no more whispered lies at the country club. I stated clearly that every single relative who had acted in bad faith, who had attempted to steal property or slander a war hero, had lost their final bequest entirely. I watched the remaining color drain out of Aunt Denise's face as I calmly reminded the room that the legal restitution claims and court sanctions against specific individuals remained fully active. Tyler dropped his gaze to the polished marble floor, his professional reputation entirely shattered. Brooke covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes as the reality of her collapsing wedding contracts finally set in. Aunt Denise was left standing in the center of the room, completely exposed, facing the humiliating, highly public reality that the woman she had ridiculed for decades had quietly saved her from total financial ruin more than once. I did not scream. I did not demand apologies or beg them to understand my pain. My revenge was colder and vastly more devastating than anything they could have anticipated. I simply stood in the bright light of the truth and let their own horrendous behavior convict them in front of everyone they were trying to impress. I set my untouched glass down on a passing waiter's tray, offered a polite nod to the stunned guests, and walked out the door, leaving my family to drown in the shallow, empty world they had chosen. Early the next morning, hours before the official press release went live and the local news crews arrived, I drove out to Fayetteville. I parked in the freshly paved driveway of the newly renovated property. The peeling floral wallpaper, the sagging porch steps, and the musty carpets were entirely gone. In their place were gleaming hardwood floors, wide accessible doorways, warm lighting, and beautiful, sturdy furniture designed to offer profound comfort to people going through the absolute worst moments of their lives. The duplex was no longer a symbol of fabricated poverty, it was a fortress of care. I walked through the quiet rooms, running my hand along the polished banister of the staircase. The deepest victory I secured in that county courtroom was not the $12 million. The money was merely a tool, a mechanism for justice. The true lasting victory was the complete, undeniable reversal of memory. Margaret Hawthorne would no longer be remembered by anyone as a poor, confused old woman who told tall tales that nobody believed. Her name was now etched in bronze. I walked back to the front entryway. I had brought one final, incredibly important item from the climate-controlled storage unit. It was Maggie's heavy, outdated wool coat, the exact same coat she had worn with fierce dignity for 15 harsh winters. I carefully hung the heavy fabric on an antique brass hook right beside the front door. Beneath the coat, Bolted securely to the wall was a polished brass plaque telling the true, unfiltered story of her service. It detailed her deployments, her brilliant medical innovations, and her unyielding dedication to human survival. It was a silent, powerful testament to the woman who had built a quiet, unassuming life so that others might loudly live. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy front door opened. A young military family, looking utterly exhausted and carrying 2 small canvas duffel bags, stepped hesitantly onto the porch. Their infant daughter was scheduled for a highly critical surgery at the nearby medical center, and they had been terrified because they had nowhere else to stay. I stepped forward, offering a warm, genuine smile, and welcomed them into the Hawthorne house. As they settled onto the plush living room couch, the crushing tension finally leaving their tired shoulders, I heard the faint, beautiful echoes of my grandmother's quiet strength reverberating through the newly painted walls. Watching them find safety in her home, I finally understood the greatest lesson Margaret Hawthorne had ever taught me. Real power does not ever need to announce itself. It does not need flashy cars, or designer clothes, or the cheap validation of arrogant people. Real power simply waits with absolute discipline, gathering its strength in the shadows, until it finds the exact right moment to change absolutely everything. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can interact and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.